All right, so I want to take a minute and unpack this idea of implicit versus explicit measures. Now, in Power BI, within the report view, implicit measures are created when you drag raw numerical fields like order quantity from our sales data table into the values pane of a visual. Now, what Power BI does is automatically select and apply an aggregation mode, typically a sum, so that you can view those numbers, those values, in a meaningful way. And that's exactly what has been going on with the values that we've been looking at in these matrix views that we've built so far. Now, on the other hand, explicit measures are created by actually entering DAX functions to explicitly define calculated columns or measures. Here we're working with measures. So, very important, implicit measures are only accessible within the specific visualization in which they're created. They're not portable, they can't be referenced anywhere else. The same exact idea as a calculated field in an Excel pivot table. It can only be accessed and analyzed in that one place. But what's great about explicit measures is that they can be used anywhere in the report once you create them, and then referenced within other DAX calculations to create more complex formulas or something that we call measure trees. So for instance, let's say that we wanted to take the sum of order quantity and then nest that within another function and create something like, total orders minus total returns to come up with our net orders or something similar. So what we would have to do in order to derive that value is actually create explicit measures for each of those components and then nest them together to create that net orders value. So let's jump into Power BI and I'll show you what I mean. All right, so we're back in Power BI, right where we left off. And in this matrix, we're looking at the sum of order quantity and the sum of return quantity by the start of year, right? And if we look at the actual details here, you can see that our default aggregation mode is sum for both of these. And that's kind of the standard or the default behavior when you drag in a numerical field like this. So for the sake of this example, let's get rid of our return quantity. And I want to create a proper explicit measure that captures the same idea, the same sum of order quantity, but then I want to be able to use it and access that sum in other measures and calculations down the line. So there are a few different ways that you can start to add new measures. And the method that you use really dictates where the new measure that you create initially lives. So number one, we could come up here and create a new measure directly from the Home tab. There's some other places like the Modeling tab that you can also create a new measure from. And when you use this method, what ends up happening is Power BI creates a record or this new measure within the first table contained within your model, right? So here we've got the calendar lookup table, right? And because we're looking at something like the sum of order quantity, it's not really associated with our calendar lookup. It's better suited to live in our sales data table. So let's just click out. And from here, if we click on the sales data table, right, you can see that we get a contextual menu here. All right, I'm going to expand this just so we can see what's going on. Right, but we get these table tool menus, right? And we can do things like create a new table, new columns, add a new measure or a quick measure. So when we click add new measure from within the sales data table tools, our new measure is now added to that sales table. If we didn't want to do that way, you could also right click on the sales data table and you have those same kind of menu options, right? New measure, new column, new quick measure, right? So again, we want to create that new measure within the sales data table. So for this measure, we're going to define this as order quantity equals, and then again, shift and enter, we're going to return down a line. And from here, this is just going to be a simple sum. And the sum function has one argument. It's just a column name. Hit shift and enter to return down a line. And from here, we can start typing in either the table name first to access all of the records within that table. You can see here that we start typing in sales and we have our sales data table. And then you have specific columns that you can access within each of these tables. And because we want to look at the order quantity, we can select the order quantity directly from the table, turn down another line, and close our parentheses. So we'll hit enter to lock that in. The other thing that I like to do whenever I create a brand new measure is make sure that it is formatted the way that I want. So again, this is going to be a whole number. and then I want to add in a comma here. The other thing that you'll note from this view as well, right? We're on the Measure Tools contextual menu because we have a measure selected. If I clicked on this column, our menu options change because we're no longer selecting a measure. So we'll jump back to that measure. You can change the table from this view where it lives. Let's say that it actually belonged in the returns table, or as a little bit of a preview here, we're actually going to be creating a dedicated table for just our measures in a little bit. So you could reassign these measures to tables directly from the Measure Tools menu here. So pretty powerful menu options. So again, this looks good. Our formatting is set appropriately. And then what happens here is when we drag this into our matrix view, we can see the exact same order quantities as the implicit version of the measure. But again, what's great about this is the explicit version of our order quantity measure, it's portable. So we can then call it and use it within other measures to create more powerful nested calculations. So one of the best practices that we're going to kind of talk about is to create explicit measures even for very simple things that you could define with an auto aggregation available implicitly. But getting in the habit of using these explicit measures will only make things easier for you down the road. So there you go. That's a really simple example of creating our first true explicit measure. One other thing that you'll notice here before we move on is that within the sales data table here, you've got these icons next to each of these fields. So when you create an explicit measure, you'll have this little calculator icon next to it. When you have a column in your table that Power BI thinks can be aggregated, you're going to have this sigma symbol. And then if you remember the quantity type column that we defined, right? So you've got this little table icon with an FX symbol that signifies that it's a calculated column. All right, so there you go. We've successfully created our first explicit measure. And up next, we're going to dig into quick measures.